It was supposed to be the quietest, most sacred moment of my life, the day I said goodbye to my only daughter. The church was filled with the soft murmur of prayers, the scent of lilies heavy in the air, and the solemn hush of friends who came to honor her. My hands trembled as I clutched the edge of the pew, staring at the polished wood of her casket, trying to accept the impossible truth. And then the doors opened. I heard the echo of footsteps before I saw him. My ex-husband. The man who hadn't spoken to me or our daughter in over 15 years. He walked down the center aisle with the arrogance of someone who believed he still had a place there. My chest tightened as he approached, every step louder than the pastor's words. He wasn't there to mourn. He wasn't there to honor the daughter he abandoned. He was there for one reason: the inheritance she had left behind. I watched as he slid into the front row beside me, like he belonged there. The smell of his expensive cologne hit me, sharp and familiar, and it made my stomach turn. I felt my whole body tense. This was the same man who had walked out on us when our daughter was still a little girl, the same man who never sent a birthday card, never made a phone call, never cared enough to ask how she was doing. Yet here he was, sitting inches from me, his presence poisoning the air, as if he had earned the right to grieve her. My thoughts raced. Anger burned hotter than my grief. How dare he stand in the same room as the people who truly loved her? How dare he come here after all this time, pretending to be the grieving father when all he wanted was a piece of the $35 million she had left behind. I tried to keep my composure, but the outrage was nearly too much. Around us, the pastor spoke of kindness, of compassion, of the life my daughter had lived and the lives she touched. And there he sat, nodding as though he had been part of her story, when in truth, he had been nothing more than a ghost she carried in her heart. That moment cut deeper than any insult, deeper than any betrayal I had ever known. Yet, even as I sat there, fighting to keep my hands from shaking, something inside me shifted. Because what he didn't know was this: my daughter had already seen this day coming. I can still remember the night he left, as clearly as if it happened yesterday. The sound of a suitcase zipper in the hallway, the hush of his shoes on the wooden floor, and the strange stillness in the air that told me our lives were about to change forever. My daughter was just 8 years old then, sitting cross-legged on the living room floor with her dolls and a blanket. Fort she had built that afternoon. She thought her daddy was only leaving for a business trip. She didn't understand that when the door closed behind him, it wouldn't open again. The hardest part was pretending for her sake. I smiled when she asked when he'd be back, and I tucked her into bed that night, whispering that everything would be okay, even though I knew it wasn't true. Behind that brave face, I was shattered. He didn't just walk out on me. He walked out on her on bedtime stories, scraped knees, school plays, and every single milestone of her childhood. In the weeks that followed, the weight of reality settled on me like a stone. Bills piled up on the kitchen counter. I picked up extra shifts at the hospital, working long nights and early mornings, praying the numbers would stretch far enough to cover rent, food, and a few small joys for her. I became both mother and father, cook and provider, comforter and protector. Some nights I would come home after a double shift to find her asleep on the couch with her homework spread out, waiting for me. Her tiny body curled under a blanket that smelled like loneliness. And yet, she carried herself with a quiet strength I didn't expect from someone so young. I saw her eyes searching the window some nights, waiting for headlights that never came. And though she never spoke of it, the disappointment carved itself into her little heart. She stopped asking about him after a while. That silence was louder than any tears. There were moments I thought the pain would swallow us whole. But somehow, she found ways to turn that emptiness into fuel. She started to channel her energy into puzzles and books, into anything that let her solve problems no one else could. I didn't realize it at the time, but that was the beginning of her resilience. She was already teaching herself how to turn hurt into something stronger, how to take the pieces her father had broken and arrange them into something new. Looking back now, I see that the day he abandoned us was the day she began building the foundation for everything she would become. While he thought he was escaping responsibility, what he really did was give her a reason to rise higher. She carried the wound, yes, but she also carried the will to make sure no one else would ever feel powerless the way she did. And that determination, the spark lit by his absence, would become the fire that shaped her future. Emma's brilliance revealed itself early, almost like it was stitched into her very being. By the time she was 12, while other kids were caught up in cartoons and schoolyard games, she was sitting at our old dining table with a secondhand laptop, teaching herself how to code. I would pass by and see her brow furrowed, her little fingers flying across the keyboard, her eyes shining with a focus that seemed far too serious for a child. At first, I worried, shouldn't she be outside, riding her bike, laughing with friends? But then I realized that this was her joy. Solving problems, building things, creating something out of nothing, that was her play. When she showed me her first app at 16, I nearly cried. It wasn't anything flashy, just a simple tool she had designed to help organize school assignments. But the fact that she could dream it, build it, and make it work, it left me speechless. And she didn't stop there. Each project got bigger, bolder, more ambitious. What amazed me wasn't just her intelligence, it was her determination. She wasn't creating for recognition. She was creating because she felt a responsibility. I knew in my heart that sense of responsibility came from the empty space her father left behind. She couldn't fill it, but she could transform it into something meaningful. Her vision became clear the year she turned 19. She told me she wanted to build a system that would protect medical data, something that could save lives by keeping records safe and accessible. At first, I thought it was a lofty dream, maybe even impossible. But Emma had this way of looking at the world that made the impossible seem small. She got accepted into a tech accelerator, secured $5,000 in seed funding. And before I could fully understand how it all worked, she had launched her company MedScure. Watching her succeed was like watching a flower bloom in fast motion. By the time she was 21, hospitals across the country were adopting her system. By 22, international organizations were knocking on her door. When Forbes called her a medical data genius, I saw her cry not out of pride, but out of exhaustion. Success was exhilarating, but it was also a heavy burden for someone so young. I tried to reassure her, to remind her that she was still just my little girl. But she always brushed it off. She carried herself with a quiet strength, as though she knew she was carrying more than just her own dreams. Still, I worried. She worked too hard, slept too little, and poured every ounce of herself into that company. I used to beg her to slow down, to take a break, but she would only smile and tell me that she was doing it for us, for me, and for every child who had ever been left behind. And then came the illness. It started small fatigue, unexplained fevers, but it quickly became something far more serious. The diagnosis was like a thunderclap in our lives. Cancer. I remember feeling the air leave my lungs as the doctor spoke. But even then, even in her weakest moments, Emma never stopped working, never stopped planning. I didn't realize it then, but while her body was fighting the disease, her mind was already preparing for something bigger than either of us could. See? Because even in sickness, she was planning something greater than I ever realized. Back in that church, I sat frozen, the grief in my chest colliding with a new wave of rage. My ex-husband's presence felt like a stain on an otherwise sacred space. He positioned himself in the front row beside me, as though he had earned that seat, tilting his head solemnly while the pastor spoke of kindness and legacy. To anyone looking in from the outside, he might have appeared to be a heartbroken father mourning his only child. But I knew the truth. He wasn't mourning. He was performing. Every nod of his head, every heavy sigh, every carefully timed look toward the casket, it was all theater. A show designed to convince everyone else in that church that he had been part of her story, that he had the right to grieve alongside us. My hands clenched together so tightly that my nails pressed into my palms. My mind screamed, but my face remained calm, because I refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. He leaned toward me during the service, his presence suffocating. I could sense the arrogance radiating from him, the entitlement in the way he carried himself. While the pastor spoke of Emma's kindness, I thought about the nights I held her through fever, the long shifts I worked to pay for her classes, the quiet moments when she asked why her father never came back. He hadn't been there for any of it. And yet, here he was, ready to claim something from her even in death. I fought to steady my breathing as I watched him scan the room, introducing himself afterward to her colleagues and friends, shaking hands as if he had been some guiding force in her success. It made my skin crawl. This wasn't grief, it was strategy. He was rewriting history right there in front of me, trying to step into a role he had abandoned years ago. But underneath my outrage, a strange calm began to grow. Because while he played the grieving father for the crowd, I knew something he didn't. His confidence, his arrogance, all of it rested on a lie. And that lie was about to crack open in ways he could never have imagined. The truth was on its way to the surface, and I could feel it pressing closer with every moment. In the days after the funeral, my ex-husband showed up at my door, this time with a lawyer at his side. I can still see the briefcase, polished leather, tucked neatly under the man's arm, and the uneasy expression he wore, as if he already knew he'd been dragged into something foul. My ex-husband, though, was all smiles, putting on the charm like he was the victim who deserved sympathy. He talked about settling Emma's estate, about parental rights, as if the last 15 years had never happened. I let them in, not because I wanted to, but because I needed to hear just how far he was willing to go. I sat across from them in my living room, surrounded by family photos, pictures of Emma at science fairs, on her graduation day, and with her first laptop balanced on her knees, memories he had no part in. But that didn't stop him from glancing at them like they somehow proved his connection to her. That's when I noticed the lawyer's hesitation. His words were careful, measured, almost apologetic. He spoke of maintained rights instead of absolute rights. He stumbled over phrases that should have been simple if my ex truly had a legal claim. My pulse quickened as I realized something wasn't adding up. And then it hit me. Years ago, when I had tried to pursue child support, the case had gone strangely silent, with explanations that never quite made sense. At the time, I was too exhausted, too buried in work and survival to press for answers. But sitting there in my living room, I began to understand. My ex-husband hadn't just abandoned us emotionally, he had signed away his parental rights voluntarily to avoid paying support for his own child. The lawyer shifted uncomfortably when I pressed, his eyes darting to my ex-husband, who suddenly seemed less confident, sweat forming at his temple. The silence between them told me everything I needed to know. He had built this entire performance on a lie, and the truth was starting to crack through the surface. That night, as I sat with the weight of it all, my phone rang. It was Victoria, Emma's mentor, the woman who had guided her through the chaos of building a company from the ground up. Her voice was calm but firm, and she told me something that made my heart ache with both pride and sorrow. Emma had anticipated this exact scenario. During her final months, when I thought she was only working on business matters, she had been quietly building legal protections, documenting her father's abandonment, and preparing evidence for the day he might try to take what he never earned. She had worked with attorneys, investigators, and advisors to make sure her legacy couldn't be stolen. I sat there, stunned, realizing just how far ahead my daughter had been thinking. While illness was draining her strength, she was still fighting to protect me, to protect her work, and to make sure the man who had broken her heart as a child would never benefit from her success. The irony was staggering. He thought he had come back to claim millions, to rewrite himself into her story. Instead, Emma had written him out long before. She had already won. As I pieced together what Victoria shared with me, I began to see just how far Emma had gone to protect her legacy. My daughter hadn't left anything to chance. She had built her defenses like a fortress layer upon layer of preparation, as though she had been anticipating every move her father might make. During her final months, when I thought she was simply reviewing contracts or meeting with investors, she had secretly hired a private investigator. That investigator uncovered things I never could have imagined. There was evidence of her father's pattern years of exploiting women, draining their savings, and disappearing when the money ran dry. There were bank statements, property records, even testimonies from women who had endured the same kind of abandonment we had. It wasn't just about protecting the inheritance. Emma was gathering proof of his character, building a record that would expose him for who he truly was. She wanted the truth preserved so that if he ever tried to stake a claim, the world would know what kind of man he really was. And yet, even as she built this fortress, Emma's compassion never wavered. That was the part that broke me and made me proud all at once. Through her investigator, she had tracked down one of the other families he had abandoned, a woman named Carol and her teenage daughter. Carol's daughter had grown up with the same questions. The same empty place where a father should have been? Emma quietly began helping her, paying for tutoring, guiding her through college applications, even arranging counseling. I realized then that Emma wasn't only protecting me or herself. She was creating a safety net for others, determined that no child would feel the same emptiness she once carried. She turned her own wound into a source of healing, not just for herself, but for every child who had been discarded by someone too selfish to stay. When Victoria placed the file in my hands, filled with evidence and documentation, I felt two things at once: a deep ache for the daughter I had lost, and a fierce pride in the woman she had become. She had been fighting battles I didn't even know existed, and she had been winning them. But then Victoria's voice softened, and she told me there was something more, something Emma had kept hidden until the end. She had prepared one final safeguard, one last secret that would change everything. In that moment, I felt the weight of anticipation pressing down on me, as if Emma's hand was still guiding mine, leading me toward the final truth she had left behind. Because as strong as her fortress already was, my daughter had one more revelation waiting to be uncovered. The day I watched Emma's final safeguard unfold, I felt as though she were still with me, guiding me step by step. Her last secret was a video she had recorded during her final weeks, a message she knew her father would one day hear. In the video, Emma looked fragile, but her eyes burned with the same determination I had seen since she was a child. She spoke directly, her voice steady, as if she were confronting him face to face. She reminded him of the choice he had made years ago when he gave up his rights to avoid paying child support. She told him she had documented everything: his lies, his schemes, and the families he had abandoned. And then she said the words that still echo in my chest. "You chose money over me when I was a little girl. And now, in the end, you will receive exactly what you gave me all those years." Nothing. It was devastating and beautiful at the same time. Her father sat pale and broken as the truth crashed down on him. The legal system didn't spare him either. With Emma's documentation in the hands of prosecutors, his fraudulent dealings were exposed. Within months, he stood in court, facing the consequences of years of deception. He lost everything: his reputation, his financial security, and the freedom he had taken for granted. But my daughter's victory was never about his downfall. It was about what she left behind. Emma's estate funded scholarships, counseling programs, and advocacy for children abandoned by parents who walked away. She turned her own heartbreak into a lifeline for others, making sure no child would feel as powerless as she once did. Even now, I sit in our home surrounded by her photos, and I feel both sorrow and pride. Emma may have been taken from me too soon, but her legacy will outlive us both. She proved that even the deepest wounds can be transformed into something that heals others. And that's the lesson I want to leave with you. Betrayal doesn't have to define your story. It can be the soil where something beautiful grows. Thank you for listening to Emma's story. If her journey moved you, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe for more stories like this. And above all, remember that your voice matters.